3 weeks after my wife's funeral, I watched my son stand outside a house he believed I knew nothing about. The doorbell camera showed Ryan beside a locksmith, his collar turned up against the cold Colorado wind, one hand pressed to his phone. "Dad doesn't even know this place exists," he said, glancing toward the windows. "Just get us inside before somebody calls the police." I was sitting 20 feet away in the darkened living room, holding the brass key Elaine had left me. I didn't open the door. I didn't call Ryan. I saved the recording, then dialed the number on the attorney's card my wife had hidden in an envelope. What troubled me wasn't only that my son had come to a house I had never mentioned. It was the confidence in his voice, as if the property already belonged to him. "My name is Walter Mercer," and until that moment, I still believed grief was the worst thing my family could do to me. "Stay with me," because I had been wrong about my son before, but never in a way that required a locksmith. To understand how I ended up hiding from my own child inside a house my dead wife had kept secret. "You have to go back to the morning after we buried her." Elaine and I had been married 44 years. We met when I was 23, wiring a new wing at the hospital where she worked in medical records. I was loud, ambitious, and convinced a man proved his love by never letting the lights get shut off. Elaine was quieter. She remembered birthdays, noticed when people lied, and could find a missing document faster than most men could find their own shoes. We built a life in Lakewood, west of Denver, in a 2-story brick house we bought when our son was 6. By the time Elaine died of pancreatic cancer at 67, the mortgage had been gone for 12 years. The place was worth more than we had ever imagined. But to me, it was still the house where Ryan scraped his knees, where Elaine canned peaches every August, and where I sat that first morning listening for footsteps that would never come. Ryan arrived before 9, carrying 2 coffees and wearing the navy sport coat he had worn to the funeral. At 41, he had the polished look of a man who never wanted anyone to guess how hard he was working to stay polished. He owned Mercer Ridge Renovations, a company that had once been featured in a local business magazine. He and his wife, Brooke, lived in a new development south of Denver with our 16-year-old granddaughter, Sophie. Ryan set one coffee beside me and looked around the kitchen as if he were already estimating square footage. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. "Not with the stairs and everything." I told him I had climbed ladders for 38 years and could probably manage 12 carpeted steps. He smiled, but his eyes didn't. "I'm serious. Dad, Mom handled more than you realized." That sentence stung because it was true. Elaine had handled insurance, taxes, medical bills, passwords, and every birthday card I had ever signed 5 minutes before dinner. Still, there was something rehearsed in Ryan's concern. Something too smooth for the morning after his mother's burial. Brooke came an hour later with cardboard boxes, labels, and the brisk sympathy of someone organizing a property she did not own. She hugged me, told me I looked exhausted, then began sorting Elaine's kitchen into piles marked Keep, Donate, and Discuss. Ryan walked through the house taking photographs on his phone. He said they were for insurance, though no insurance company had requested them. At lunch, he mentioned a senior community near his neighborhood with a fitness center, transportation, and people at your stage of life. I looked at him across Elaine's dining table and asked, "What stage is that?" Brooke answered before he could. "A stage where you deserve less responsibility." She meant it kindly, or at least wanted it to sound kind. I reminded them Elaine had been gone less than 24 hours. Ryan leaned back and rubbed his forehead. "That's exactly why we should make decisions before things get overwhelming." I should have stopped the conversation there. Instead, I did what I had done most of his life. I mistook urgency for need and pressure for love. I had spent years making that mistake. When Ryan was a boy, I worked shutdowns at refineries and manufacturing plants, sometimes 12-hour shifts for weeks at a time. I missed 2 school plays, 1 championship game, and the afternoon he broke his wrist skateboarding. Each time, I came home with a gift or money for something he wanted. Lauder. Elaine warned me I was teaching him to connect disappointment with compensation. I laughed and said every kid should have a father who could provide. When he went to college, we paid what scholarships did not cover. When he bought his first home, I gave him $60,000 for the down payment. When he started Mercer Ridge, I guaranteed an $85,000 equipment loan. He paid that one back, and I treated it as proof that my faith had been justified. Over the years, there were smaller rescues, a payroll shortage, a tax bill, an expensive repair he claimed would ruin his reputation if delayed. I rarely asked for documentation. Elaine always did. At the time, I thought she was being suspicious. After her funeral, I began to wonder whether she had simply been paying attention. That afternoon, while Ryan and Brooke carried donation boxes to their SUV, I went upstairs to Elaine's sewing room. It was the one place they had not touched because I told them I wanted to sort it myself. Sunlight fell across the cutting table, illuminating loose threads, folded fabric, and the reading glasses she had worn during her last good winter. I opened drawers slowly, afraid of what every ordinary object might do to me. Beneath a stack of quilt patterns, I found a cream-colored envelope with my name written in Elaine's careful block letters. Underneath, she had added, "For Walt only. Open when the house becomes too quiet." My hands began shaking before I broke the seal. Inside was a brass key on a plain ring, a typed address in Colorado Springs, a copy of a recorded beneficiary deed, and a business card for Helen Park, an estate attorney whose name I vaguely recognized from Elaine's stories about hospital fundraisers. There was no explanation. Only one handwritten sentence: "Please understand everything before you tell Ryan." I read it 3 times, then slipped the envelope inside my jacket. I called Helen from the garage after Ryan and Brooke left. She answered on the second ring and, when I gave my name, became quiet. "I'm sorry about Elaine," she said. "She hoped you wouldn't need to contact me this soon." That was the first moment fear pushed through my grief. Helen asked whether I had opened the envelope alone and whether Ryan knew about it. I said no. She told me not to discuss the property until we met. "Property," I repeated, though the deed had already told me enough to make the word feel unreal. Helen explained that Elaine had inherited a house from her aunt in 2018, because inherited property can remain separate property when handled correctly. Elaine had kept it in her name. She later executed and recorded a beneficiary deed, transferring it to me upon her death. "The house is yours now," Helen said. "There's no mortgage." I leaned against my workbench, staring at the pegboard where my tools hung in perfect rows. Elaine and I had never hidden purchases from each other, not even a $300 generator. Yet she had hidden an entire house for nearly 8 years. The next morning, I drove 70 miles south under a low gray sky. The address led me to an older neighborhood lined with cottonwoods and modest homes built in the 1960s. Elaine's house stood at the end of a quiet street, a narrow 2-story place with pale blue siding, white shutters, and a small stone porch. It was not luxurious, but it had been cared for. The gutters were clean, the shrubs trimmed, and a new security camera watched the front steps. My key opened the lock without resistance. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and lemon polish. There was furniture, canned food in the pantry, fresh batteries in a kitchen drawer, and one of Elaine's sweaters folded over the back of a chair. On the mantel stood a photograph of us taken in Santa Fe 10 years earlier. I picked it up and felt anger rise beneath the sorrow. She had lived a second life here, even if only in scattered afternoons. I wanted to demand an explanation from a woman who could no longer defend herself. Instead, I walked room to room, looking for proof that our marriage had meant something different to her than it had to me. Upstairs, one bedroom had been converted into an office. The door was locked, and the brass key did not fit. The rest of the house held clues but no answers. Utility bills paid from an account I did not recognize, repair receipts bearing Elaine's signature, a calendar marked with initials instead of names. In the kitchen, I found tea she liked and coffee she knew I hated. That small detail stopped me. Elaine had not furnished the house for us. She had furnished it for herself, or perhaps for someone else who drank coffee. By noon, grief had turned into suspicion, and suspicion made me ashamed. I called Helen again. She asked me not to force the office door. Elaine left instructions about that room. She said, "We should go through them together." When I asked why my wife had hidden the house, Helen paused. She believed secrecy was necessary to protect you. I almost laughed. From what Helen's answer came slowly. Not what? Walt. Who? Before I could ask more, my phone buzzed with a text from Ryan. Did Mom own any property in her name only? I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Ryan had never shown much interest in the legal details of his mother's estate. At the funeral home, he asked about insurance. At breakfast, he asked whether our mortgage was fully paid. Now, less than 48 hours after the burial, he was asking about separately owned property. I replied, "Why do you ask?" His answer came immediately, accountant question. Nothing important. I did not tell him where I was. I did not tell him about the deed, the locked office, or Helen. On the drive home, I remembered something from Elaine's final month. Ryan had visited twice when I was picking up prescriptions. Both times, I returned to find him alone in our bedroom, supposedly looking for old family photographs. Elaine had watched him with an expression I interpreted as irritation. Now I wondered whether it had been fear. When I reached Lakewood, Ryan's truck was already in the driveway. He was sitting at the kitchen table beside a black leather folder, smiling with the patient expression people use when speaking to the injured. "Good," he said. "We need to get a few things organized." The folder contained a durable power of attorney, authorization forms for my bank and investment accounts, and an agreement allowing Ryan's company to prepare and market the Lakewood house. Small yellow tabs marked every place my signature was required. Ryan slid a pen toward me. "This doesn't mean we're selling tomorrow," he said. "It just lets me act if you get overwhelmed." I read the first page twice. The document did not merely allow him to pay bills in an emergency. It gave him broad authority over real estate, investments, taxes, and legal claims. "Who prepared this?" I asked. Ryan said a lawyer his company used. I looked at Brooke, who was standing near the sink with her arms folded. She avoided my eyes. "You two planned this before the funeral," I said. Ryan's jaw tightened. "We discussed protecting you before Mom died. She knew you weren't prepared to handle everything." I pushed the folder back. "Then you should have discussed it with me." His voice changed. "Dad, grief can affect judgment. You're not thinking clearly." I told him the clearest decision I had made all week was refusing to sign. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The refrigerator hummed behind us, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice. Ryan gathered the papers but left the pen on the table. "You always do this," he said quietly. "You make everything harder because you can't admit when you need help." I asked whether help normally came with authority to sell another man's house. Brooke stepped forward and said, "Nobody is trying to take anything. We're trying to prevent a crisis." I looked at her. "What crisis?" She opened her mouth, but Ryan answered first. "The crisis where you fall, get sick, miss payments, or let some stranger talk you into something." His wording was too specific. I thought of Helen. I thought of the envelope in Elaine's warning. "What stranger?" I asked. Ryan stood so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. "Forget it. Keep pretending you're fine." At the door, he turned and said, "When something goes wrong, don't say I didn't try." After they left, I locked the deadbolt, something I had never done while my son was still visible from the window. The next day, Helen met me at the Colorado Springs house. She was a compact woman with silver-streaked black hair and a leather briefcase worn soft at the corners. She confirmed the deed was valid, recorded, and outside the ordinary probate process. She also confirmed Elaine had instructed her not to notify Ryan. "Your wife was not trying to punish him," Helen said. "She was trying to give you time." I asked whether Elaine believed Ryan would challenge the estate. Helen chose her words carefully. "She believed he might pressure you before you understood your position." That was not the same as an accusation, but it was close. Helen handed me a copy of the property records and pointed out that only Elaine's name appeared in the chain of title after her aunt's death. "No lien, no co-owner, no agreement involving Ryan. Do not sign anything concerning your residence, this house, or your accounts without independent review," she said. I told her my son would never knowingly steal from me. Helen looked toward the locked office upstairs. "Then let us hope Elaine was mistaken." That evening, I sat alone in the Lakewood living room with the television off and Elaine's envelope on my lap. I wanted to call Ryan, tell him everything, and demand an explanation that would restore the world to something recognizable. Maybe he had learned about the Colorado Springs house from his mother. Maybe his questions were clumsy concern. Maybe the paperwork was aggressive but harmless. A father can build an entire shelter out of the word maybe. At 8:17, my phone rang. The caller identified herself as a fraud prevention specialist from our bank. She asked whether I had submitted an application for a home equity line of credit against my Lakewood property. I said no. She asked whether I had authorized a request for $250,000. I stood so quickly Elaine's envelope fell to the floor. Absolutely not. The specialist explained that the application contained my social security number, retirement income, account balances, and an electronic signature matching my name. Before freezing it, she needed to verify the secondary contact listed on the submission. I already knew the answer before she said it. Still, hearing my son's full name in a stranger's voice changed something inside me. The additional contact is Ryan Mercer, she said. Do you know him? I looked at the family photograph above the fireplace, Ryan at 10, missing a front tooth, sitting on my shoulders while Elaine laughed beside us. He's my son, I answered. The specialist asked whether he had permission to apply on my behalf. My throat tightened, but my voice remained steady. No. She placed a fraud alert on the request and advised me to secure my accounts immediately. After the call, I checked the front door, then the windows, as though financial betrayal might enter through glass. On the kitchen table, the pen Ryan had left behind lay beside a faint indentation where the power of attorney papers had rested. Elaine had told me to understand everything before I spoke. For the first time in my life, I decided not to rescue my son from the consequences of what he had done. First, I needed to learn how much he had already taken. I called Ryan the next morning and asked him to come alone. He arrived 20 minutes later wearing jeans, work boots, and the impatient expression he used with subcontractors who had missed a deadline. I placed a printed copy of the bank's fraud notice on the kitchen table. Why is your name on a $250,000 loan application against my house? I asked. Ryan did not look surprised. That frightened me more than anger would have. He read the first page, exhaled through his nose, and said, I was checking what options were available. I told him checking did not require my social security number, investment balances, or an electronic signature. He leaned back and crossed his arms. Nothing was funded. Dad, no money moved. You're acting like I emptied your account. I asked whether he had submitted the application. He answered with a lawyer's precision. I helped prepare preliminary information. When I asked who authorized him, he stared at me for a long moment and said, Mom knew I was trying to make sure you wouldn't be stranded. Elaine's name landed between us like a weapon. I asked exactly what she had known, and Ryan's confidence slipped for half a second. She knew the house was your biggest asset. He said, she knew you'd need help managing things. I reminded him that his mother had left no instruction giving him control over anything. He rubbed both hands over his face and changed tactics. You want the truth, fine. You were never around when I needed you. Mom handled the family while you worked every holiday and every emergency shutdown. Now she's gone. And you expect me to pretend you suddenly understand paperwork, health decisions, and estate planning. There was enough truth in his accusation to hurt. I had missed things. I had let Elaine carry burdens I should have shared. But guilt did not explain a forged signature. My failures as a father don't make my house yours, I said. Ryan's mouth tightened. I never said it was mine. I tapped the bank notice, then stopped trying to borrow against it. He stood, called me paranoid, and left without touching the coffee I had poured. An hour later, Brooke called. Her voice was softer than Ryan's, but the message was the same. She said he was under tremendous pressure and that my accusation had humiliated him. I asked whether she knew about the loan request. There was a pause long enough to answer the question. He told me he was looking into refinancing possibilities. She said, for your benefit. I asked what benefit required $250,000. She replied that the money could prepare the house for sale, cover moving costs, and place me somewhere safer. When I told her the house needed neither repairs nor a buyer, she said, "Walt, this is exactly what Ryan means. You hear concern as control." I almost ended the call, but then she added, "You've been forgetting things since Elaine got sick." That was false, and it was too specific to be casual. I asked for an example. Brooke mentioned a dinner reservation I missed 6 months earlier. Elaine had been in the emergency room that night. I realized they were not merely defending the application. They were building a story about my mind. By noon, I had canceled the credit request, frozen my credit reports, changed every banking password, and added verbal verification instructions to my accounts. The work steadied me. For 38 years, when a motor failed or a breaker kept tripping, I did not shout at the machinery. I isolated the circuit, tested each connection, and found where the current had gone wrong. I decided to treat Ryan's behavior the same way. The hardest call was to our investment firm. The representative asked whether I believed a family member had accessed my information. I stared at Ryan's childhood photograph on the refrigerator and said yes. I hated myself for how quietly the word came out. That afternoon, I found 2 recent login alerts from devices I did not recognize. Both occurred on days Ryan had visited during Elaine's illness. Nothing had been withdrawn, but someone had viewed account balances and beneficiary information. I printed every alert and placed the pages in a new accordion folder. On the front, I wrote one word in black marker: facts. The damage spread faster than I expected. My sister-in-law, Marlena, called from Fort Collins and asked whether I was having trouble keeping things straight. Ryan had told her I accused him of stealing because I was confused after Elaine's death. A cousin sent me the phone number of a grief counselor. Even my neighbor Frank stopped by with banana bread and asked whether someone should be checking on me at night. None of them meant harm. That was what made Ryan's approach effective. He did not tell people I was insane. He told them he was worried. Concern is harder to defend against than cruelty because every objection can be presented as evidence of instability. I called Ryan and demanded he stop discussing my health. "People care about you," he said. "You can't punish them for noticing." I asked whether he had contacted my doctor. He went silent, then said he had only asked the office what warning signs families should watch for. I hung up before anger did his work for him. An outburst was exactly what he needed. 2 days later, a supplier from Aurora called the house asking for Ryan. He said my number appeared on an old credit reference for Mercer Ridge renovations and that several invoices were past due. I told him Ryan did not live with me. The man apologized, then asked whether I still guaranteed the company's obligations. Still, I repeated. He explained that his records mentioned a personal guarantee connected to an expanded business credit line. I said I had guaranteed one equipment loan years earlier, and it had been paid. He suggested I speak to Ryan or the lender directly. When I called the lender, the representative would not release details without written authorization, but she confirmed there was an active account associated with my name. I felt the room narrow around me. I asked her to send any document bearing my signature to Helen Park. Before hanging up, she warned that the account was current only because minimum payments were being made. That meant Ryan was not simply short on cash. He was balancing debts, keeping each one alive long enough to reach something larger: my house, my savings, or whatever else he believed Elaine had left behind. Helen arranged a meeting with Daniel Cho, a forensic accountant who had once investigated procurement fraud for a hospital system where Elaine worked. Daniel was in his 50s, spoke carefully, and treated every document as if it could lie. I brought the bank notice, account alerts, supplier information, and the power of attorney packet Ryan had left behind. Daniel asked whether Ryan had regular access to my mail, tax returns, and identification. I explained that he had helped Elaine organize paperwork during treatment and sometimes collected mail when we were at the hospital. Daniel made no accusation. He simply wrote down dates. Then he asked me to list every financial rescue I had given Ryan in the past 10 years. The total embarrassed me. There were loans I had mentally converted into gifts I had called investments, and emergency payments Elaine never approved. "Did you require statements or repayment schedules?" Daniel asked. I shook my head. He did not criticize me, which somehow felt worse. People rarely begin with major fraud. He said, they begin where boundaries are weakest. I thought of all the times I had said, he's my son, as if that sentence canceled every ordinary rule. Helen and I returned to the Colorado Springs house the following morning. The locked office door still bothered me. Elaine had left instructions, but Helen said we first needed to find a second key mentioned in a note attached to her file. The note read, Walt will know where to look when he stops thinking like a husband and starts thinking like an electrician. I stood in the upstairs hallway, irritated by the riddle until I noticed the office lights were off, even though the switch was up. I went downstairs to the electrical panel in the basement. Behind the hinged directory card, taped inside the metal cover, was a small silver key. Elaine had watched me hide spare truck keys in breaker panels for years. The choice was not sentimental. It was practical, private, and unmistakably meant for me. Upstairs, the key opened the office. The room contained a desk, 2 locking file cabinets, a scanner, and shelves filled with labeled binders. There were no love letters, no second family, and no proof of a secret life. There was only paperwork, years of it. One binder was marked Ryan Requests. Inside, Elaine had kept copies of emails, text message, checks, wire confirmations, and handwritten notes documenting every time our son asked for money. Each section included what Ryan told us, what he received, and what Elaine later discovered. A $40,000 payroll emergency had occurred the same month. Mercer Ridge leased 2 luxury trucks. $12,000 for a supplier dispute was followed by photographs from a company retreat in Aspen. A request to cover Sophie's private school tuition had arrived after the tuition had already been paid from Brooks Family Trust. The pattern was not simple greed. Ryan's company had genuine cash flow problems, but he hid his choices, exaggerated emergencies, and used family obligations to make refusal feel cruel. In the margins, Elaine had written questions I never asked. Why no bank statement? Why is the amount different? Why must this be done today? On the final page, dated 4 months before her death, she wrote, Walt will help him again unless the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Another file contained a photocopy of a business guarantee dated 11 months earlier. The document pledged my personal responsibility for up to $150,000 of Mercer Ridge debt. My name was printed beneath a signature that looked disturbingly familiar. I remembered the day Ryan brought papers to the hospital cafeteria. Elaine had been upstairs receiving chemotherapy. He told me an insurance carrier needed confirmation that I had reviewed safety requirements for a renovation project. I signed 2 pages while watching the elevator, worried Elaine might need me. The guarantee in my hand contained a signature positioned at the same angle, with the same broken loop in the W of Walter. Yet I had never seen the document. Helen studied it without touching the ink. This may be copied from something you signed legitimately, she said. My first instinct was still to defend him. I said there could be a clerical mistake. Helen looked around the room Elaine had created to protect me from my own excuses. There could be, she answered. That is why we verify instead of assume. I drove home determined to confront Ryan, but Daniel called before I reached Castle Rock. He had spoken with the lender and needed more time to compare originals. Do not warn him yet, he said. If someone altered documents, an accusation may cause records to disappear. I hated the idea of behaving normally, but anger would have cost me whatever advantage Elaine had preserved. That evening, I called Ryan and told him I had been thinking about the house. I said the rooms felt empty and the maintenance might eventually become too much. His voice softened instantly. That's all I've been trying to tell you. I said I would consider selling after Elaine's 60-day memorial gathering. I did not promise to sign anything. Ryan heard what he wanted. He offered to have his crews inspect the roof, paint the interior, and prepare a market analysis at no charge. Then he said, almost casually, once the equity is liquid, we can make sure it's working for the family instead of sitting in bricks. There it was, not my retirement, not my security, but the family, a word he used whenever he wanted my property to sound communal. The next week, Ryan became the son I had been missing. He brought lunch, fixed a loose railing, and drove me to the cemetery without being asked. He spoke about Elaine with real tenderness, which made everything harder. Betrayal would have been simpler if he had stopped loving us. Instead, he seemed to love us through a private accounting system in which affection entitled him to access. At a diner near Colfax Avenue, he apologized for moving too fast with the power of attorney. I told him I understood he was under pressure. He looked down at his coffee and admitted business had been difficult. Nothing I can't handle, he added quickly. I asked how much he owed. He smiled and said every contractor carried debt. When I pressed, he accused me of interrogating him. Then he recovered and reached across the table. Dad, sell the house because it's right for you, not because of me. His hand rested over mine, warm and familiar. I almost believed him. Then I noticed he had brought a folder containing 3 suggested real estate agents, all connected to Brooke. Sophie visited me alone on Saturday. She arrived on her bicycle, claimed she needed help with an algebra assignment, and spent 10 minutes pretending to care about equations before closing the textbook. Grandpa, are you selling the house because Dad needs money? She asked. I told her adult finances were not her responsibility. She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve and said she had heard her parents arguing after midnight. Brooke kept asking what would happen if the old house didn't close. Ryan told her, once the old house closes, I can cover the private note. Sophie did not know what that meant, but she had seen him place a thick file labeled Walter Mercer in the office safe. I asked whether her father knew she had overheard them. She shook her head. I made her promise not to search the safe or confront either parent. You are not my spy, I told her. You are my granddaughter. Relief crossed her face, followed by fear. Before leaving, she hugged me longer than usual and whispered, Dad keeps saying everything will be okay after you sign. Daniel called that evening. He had obtained a high-resolution scan of the guarantee from the lender and compared it with documents I had genuinely signed. He also examined metadata from the bank's home equity application. The signatures were not independently written. He said, the business guarantee signature was lifted from a hospital insurance acknowledgement you signed last year. The home equity signature came from the power of attorney draft Ryan brought you. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pen my son had left behind. Daniel continued. The scaling, pixel artifacts, and pen breaks match. Someone copied your signatures and placed them onto financial documents. I asked whether he was certain as I can be without the original computer. He said, this was no desperate act committed after Elaine's funeral. Ryan had collected my signature months earlier, prepared a guarantee while his mother was dying, and then used the same method again when he believed grief had made me easier to control. The betrayal was not one bad decision. It was a system. The morning after Daniel confirmed the copied signatures, I drove to Colorado Springs before sunrise. I carried the fax folder on the passenger seat and Elaine's envelope inside my coat. The highway was nearly empty, the mountains dark against a pale sky. I kept hearing Daniel's words, not one bad decision, but a system. Systems are built deliberately. They require repetition, planning, and confidence that nobody will interrupt them. That last part belonged to me. I had taught Ryan that every crisis ended with my checkbook opening. I had mistaken intervention for fatherhood until he began treating my consent as a formality. At the Blue House, Helen was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. I told her about the forensic report before we went inside. She listened without surprise, which irritated me. You expected this, I said. Elaine feared it. She answered, that is not the same thing. We climbed to the office, where Helen removed a sealed letter from her briefcase. Across the front, Elaine had written open only if Ryan tries to control Walt's property. I sat at the desk while Helen broke the seal. The letter was 6 pages long, written in the steady handwriting Elaine maintained even after chemotherapy made her hands ache. She described finding Ryan in our bedroom one afternoon while I was at the pharmacy. He claimed he was looking for insurance cards, but Elaine later discovered the lock on our filing cabinet had been scratched. Several tax documents had been moved. A week later, Ryan asked oddly specific questions about our investment beneficiaries and whether the Lakewood house could secure a business loan. Elaine confronted him. He denied touching anything and accused her medication of making her suspicious. The letter said she wanted to tell me, but I had already given Ryan money twice that year and dismissed her concerns as stress. That sentence burned because I remembered the argument. I had told her, "He's our son, not a criminal." Elaine had gone quiet and never raised the subject again. In the letter, she wrote, "Walt believes trust is something a father owes forever. I believe trust is something even a son must protect." Helen turned to the second page. Elaine explained that the Colorado Springs house had never been a retreat from our marriage. She inherited it from her aunt in 2018, intending to sell it, but changed her mind when Ryan began asking for larger sums and pressing for access to our records. She used the house as a secure mailing address, stored duplicate statements there, and met Helen in the office because Ryan frequently entered our Lakewood home without notice. The coffee, furniture, and sweater that had made me imagine a second life were simply practical comforts for long afternoons spent reviewing documents. The calendar initials belonged to Helen, Daniel, a property manager, and Elaine's oncologist. I felt ashamed of the suspicions I had entertained, but the shame quickly gave way to another pain. My wife had spent the final years of her life preparing defenses against our own child, while I continued handing him money. Why didn't she force me to listen, I asked. Helen's expression softened. She tried. You defended Ryan before she finished speaking. I had no answer, because I remembered doing exactly that. The third page changed everything. Elaine wrote that she believed Ryan had already discovered hints of the property. Not because she had made a mistake, but because she had left him something to find. During her illness, she placed an outdated appraisal in the Lakewood filing cabinet, one showing the Colorado Springs address, but omitting the deed history and beneficiary transfer. She knew Ryan had searched the cabinet before. She wanted to see whether he would mention the property honestly or investigate it in secret. It was not a trap designed to make him fail. She wrote, it was a final chance for him to ask instead of take. The appraisal later disappeared. Ryan never asked either of us about the house. Elaine then saw a search for the address in the browser history on a tablet he had borrowed. The revelation forced me to reinterpret the entire story. Ryan had not stumbled onto the house after his mother died. He had known enough to hunt for it while she was still alive. His question about separately owned property after the funeral had not been curiosity. He had been checking whether I had discovered what he already suspected. I stood and walked to the window. The street below was quiet, ordinary, almost insulting in its calm. She tested him, I said. Helen shook her head. She gave him a choice. I wanted to defend Ryan again. To say grief, debt, or panic had distorted his judgment. But the appraisal had disappeared months before the funeral. The copied guarantee had been created while Elaine was receiving treatment. The home equity application came later. After he thought I was alone and vulnerable, the pattern crossed too many moments to be explained by one emergency. Still, Elaine's strategy hurt me. She tested me too. I said. Helen did not disagree. In the final pages, Elaine wrote that she had kept the deed secret because she believed I would sell the second house to save Ryan's business if I knew he was in trouble. She loved my generosity, she said, but feared it had become dangerous. I do not want Walt to choose between being a father and protecting himself, she wrote, so I am leaving him time before Ryan makes the choice feel urgent. Daniel joined us that afternoon with a preliminary report on Mercer Ridge renovations. Public filings showed tax liens, equipment leases, and 2 lawsuits from subcontractors. None alone explained Ryan's desperation. Daniel had traced payments through 3 limited liability companies connected to renovation projects. One company existed only on paper and had received transfers from Mercer Ridge before sending money to cover personal credit cards, vehicle payments, and a private loan. That loan had an original balance of $240,000 and came due in less than 5 weeks. The lender was not a bank but a local developer named Grant Bell, known for financing distressed construction companies at high interest. Ryan had apparently promised repayment from the sale or refinancing of family real estate. Daniel could not yet prove which property Ryan meant, but the amount matched the home equity request closely enough to remove coincidence. He needs your house to survive, I said. Daniel corrected me. He believes he needs your house to avoid admitting the company may not survive. That distinction mattered. Ryan was not stealing food for a hungry child. He was stealing time to preserve an image. I asked what would happen if the private loan came due unpaid. Daniel said Bell could sue, seize pledged business assets, and expose the other debts during discovery. Mercer Ridge might enter bankruptcy. Ryan and Brooke's own house could also be at risk, because Daniel found a financing statement suggesting Ryan had used personal property as collateral. I thought of Sophie, who had done nothing wrong. The old reflex rose immediately: sell something. Pay Bell. Protect the family. Helen watched the idea form on my face. This is the moment Elaine feared, she said. I snapped that she had no right to tell me what my wife feared. The room went silent. I apologized. But the anger was not really for Helen. It was for Elaine, for Ryan, and for myself. I had spent decades believing money could absorb pain before it reached the people I loved. Yet every rescue had merely moved the pain forward and increased the cost. If I paid Bell, Ryan would keep the company, keep the lie, and learn that forged signatures were only another emergency his father could erase. We decided I needed full disclosure from Ryan before taking legal action, not because he deserved another rescue, but because his own records could establish the scope of the fraud and protect me from future claims. I called him that evening and said I was ready to discuss selling the Lakewood house. I added that I might invest part of the proceeds in Mercer Ridge if the company was as sound as he claimed. Ryan became cautious. You don't have to invest, he said, trying to sound generous. Just getting you somewhere manageable would be enough. I told him I had spent my career reading bids, change orders, and maintenance budgets. If my money was involved, I wanted a complete debt schedule reviewed by Helen. Ryan disliked her name. She's filling your head with suspicion, he said. I answered. Then prove her wrong. After a long pause, he agreed. He promised bank statements, loan agreements, accounts payable, pending lawsuits, and all personal guarantees. His voice brightened as he spoke, already imagining the money. Before hanging up, he said, this could fix everything for all of us. 3 days later, Ryan brought me a glossy report bound in navy plastic. It included photographs of completed kitchens, revenue charts, equipment lists, and optimistic projections for the coming year. The debt schedule showed $78,000 in supplier obligations and a manageable equipment balance. There was no private loan, no paper company, and no mention of the lawsuits Daniel had found. I turned the pages slowly while Ryan sat across from me. Is this everything I asked? He met my eyes. Every material obligation. I pointed to a transfer labeled Bridge Consulting. He said it was a project management firm. Daniel had already identified Bridge Consulting as one of Ryan's shell companies. Who owns it? I asked. Ryan's mouth hardened. Why does that matter? I closed the report. Because you asked me to trust you with my house. He stood and accused Helen of poisoning me against him. Then he softened, placed both hands on the table, and said, Dad, I'm trying to keep my employees working. Real people have families depending on me. It was a strong argument because parts of it were true. Ryan's lies had always worked best when wrapped around someone else's need. I visited the Mercer Ridge office the next afternoon without warning. The receptionist recognized me and said Ryan was at a job site. I told her I would wait. His office door was open, and I stepped inside under the pretense of leaving the report on his desk. A large monitor displayed several property photographs, likely from a real estate search. One image showed the pale blue house in Colorado Springs. Beneath it was a report listing Elaine as the prior owner and me as a possible successor. The search date was 4 days after the funeral. My hand moved toward my phone to photograph the screen, but the receptionist appeared behind me and said Ryan did not allow anyone near his computer. I apologized and left. In the parking lot, I sat inside my truck, breathing through the anger. The locksmith had not been a spontaneous idea. Ryan had researched title records, found the address, and gone there believing the deed had not yet been transferred, or that documents inside might help him claim it. He was not waiting to inherit. He was inventorying my life. Brooke came to the Lakewood house that night without Ryan. She looked exhausted and kept her coat on. I placed the private loan information on the table but did not show her Elaine's files. "Did you know about Grant Bell?" I asked. Brooke stared at the name, then shook her head. She admitted Ryan had told her the business needed temporary cash but claimed upcoming projects would cover it. I asked whether their home had been pledged as collateral. Her face lost color. "He said I signed a routine refinancing package." She whispered. I heard my own story in those words. She asked whether I intended to report him. I said I intended to protect myself and uncover the truth. Brooke pressed her fingers to her temples. "If the company collapses, we lose everything." I told her Ryan had used that fear against both of us. For a moment, I thought she might help. Then she folded the papers and pushed them back. "He made mistakes. But you have 2 houses and more money than you'll ever spend. You could end this." Her fear had turned into entitlement before my eyes. Later, Helen called with news from the probate file. Ryan's attorney had requested information about my medical history and asked whether I had recently changed estate documents under outside influence. The request had no legal force yet, but it suggested preparation for a challenge. I told Helen about Brooke's visit and the incomplete debt report. "He knows persuasion is failing," she said. "The next step may be to question your capacity." I remembered Ryan contacting my doctor and telling relatives I was confused. The Concern campaign had never been random. He had been laying groundwork. Helen advised me to schedule an independent cognitive evaluation and document my daily financial decisions. I hated the humiliation of proving I could think. Still, I agreed. The next morning, I completed memory tests, problem-solving exercises, and a medical examination with a geriatric specialist who found no sign of impairment. I left the clinic relieved but angry. My son had turned ordinary aging into evidence against me, using every forgotten reservation and moment of grief as material for a case he had not yet filed. The papers arrived 2 days later by certified delivery. Ryan had petitioned the county court for temporary conservatorship and guardianship, claiming I was making reckless financial decisions, concealing assets, and being manipulated by Helen. His affidavit described my visit to the Colorado Springs property as confused, wandering, and my refusal to sign the power of attorney as proof I did not understand my needs. Brooke submitted a supporting statement saying I had become suspicious, isolated, and hostile after Elaine's death. Ryan asked for immediate authority to prevent me from selling, transferring, or encumbering property until a court evaluation. I read the petition twice, then called him. "You're asking a judge to take away my right to manage my own life," I said. Ryan's voice was calm. "I'm asking for protection until you're stable." I told him the doctor had found me competent. "A private doctor Helen arranged," he replied. "That proves nothing." He had anticipated the evaluation. Every defense I made had already been rewritten as evidence of manipulation. The petition did not immediately give Ryan control, but it caused enough uncertainty for my investment firm to restrict transfers, while its legal department reviewed the dispute. A representative explained that they could not risk honoring large transactions if a court later appointed a conservator. I could still pay ordinary expenses, but I could not move significant funds or change beneficiaries without additional review. Ryan had not won, yet he had managed to freeze the very independence he claimed to protect. Helen filed an emergency objection and requested sanctions for false statements. But the hearing would not occur for nearly 2 weeks. That evening, Ryan came to the house and stood on the porch without knocking. Through the glass, he looked less like my son than a man collecting a debt. I opened the door but did not invite him in. "This can all stop," he said. "Sign the power of attorney. Agree to sell, and I'll withdraw the petition." I asked whether that was concern or extortion. He looked away. "Call it whatever helps you sleep." I told him I would see him in court. His face tightened, and for the first time, the mask of patient concern fell away. "You think that lawyer and mom's secret files make you untouchable," he said. "But judges understand families. They'll see an old man hiding property and making irrational decisions after his wife died." The words confirmed he knew more about the Colorado Springs house than I had revealed. I asked how he found it. He smiled without warmth. "You're not the only one who knows how to read public records." Then he stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You always said everything you built was for me." I'm just asking you to mean it. I closed the door between us. My investment accounts were restricted. My reputation was under attack. And a court petition now portrayed self-protection as mental decline. For the first time since Elaine's death, I understood the full danger. Ryan did not merely want my money. He wanted legal authority to make my refusal irrelevant. The morning of my court-ordered evaluation, I wore the same charcoal suit I had worn to Elaine's funeral. Helen told me I did not need to dress formally, but I wanted the evaluator to see the man I still was, not the fragile version Ryan had described in his petition. Dr. Miriam Feld spent nearly 3 hours testing my memory, judgment, attention, and ability to understand financial consequences. She asked me to explain the difference between the two houses, describe the disputed loan applications, and calculate how long my retirement income could cover ordinary expenses. I answered without rushing. When she asked why I had concealed the Colorado Springs property from my son, I said, because knowledge is not ownership, and grief did not create an obligation to surrender my privacy. She looked at me for a moment, then continued writing. By the end, I was exhausted and angry, but I had given Ryan nothing he could use. 2 days later, Dr. Feld's preliminary opinion stated that I showed no evidence of cognitive impairment and fully understood my legal and financial decisions. Helen could have filed Elaine's entire archive with the court immediately, but we decided against it. The guardianship petition was already weakening, and exposing every document too soon might drive Ryan to destroy whatever remained in his office. Instead, Helen submitted the medical report, my banking records, and a narrow affidavit denying the allegations. I continued acting as if the case had frightened me into compliance. When Ryan called, I lowered my voice and said the stress was becoming too much. Maybe you were right about selling, I told him. Silence followed. Then the return of his gentle, reasonable tone. I never wanted to fight you, Dad. I just need you to let me handle the complicated parts. I said I would agree to a family meeting after Elaine's 60-day memorial and would consider placing money into Mercer Ridge if the sale proceeded smoothly. Ryan asked how much. I hesitated deliberately before saying, possibly $300,000. He exhaled so softly I might have missed it if I had not been listening for relief. That would protect everyone, he said. I wrote the sentence down as soon as we hung up. Ryan moved quickly. Within 48 hours, Brooke had prepared a listing presentation for the Lakewood house, complete with comparable sales, renovation estimates, and a proposed closing schedule. She placed the suggested listing price at $735,000 and recommended accepting an off-market buyer represented by one of her associates. The speed told me the buyer had likely been waiting. Ryan's company offered to complete cosmetic repairs and be paid from the closing proceeds. Buried in the contractor agreement was a broad reimbursement clause that would allow Mercer Ridge to claim expenses without prior written approval. Helen circled it in red. They are trying to create several channels into the same money, she said. The sale, the repair contract, and the proposed investment would each move funds under Ryan's influence. I asked whether signing anything could strengthen his guardianship claim. Yes, she answered. So, we will let him believe you are willing without giving him an enforceable document. I hated pretending to be weaker than I was. But electricians learn early that a live wire is most dangerous when you forget it is live. I intended to let Ryan carry the current directly to the breaker. At our next meeting, Ryan brought an investment agreement drafted by his business attorney. It promised me a preferred return from Mercer Ridge and described the company as temporarily undercapitalized but fundamentally profitable. The money would be used for existing operational obligations, project completion costs, and strategic restructuring. No lender was named. No debt schedule was attached. I read the agreement slowly and asked simple questions. The kind Ryan now believed proved my confusion. What does strategic restructuring mean? I asked. He glanced at Brooke before answering. It means paying down expensive obligations so the company can operate normally. I asked which obligations. He said the accounting schedule was still being finalized. Then I asked why $300,000 was required if the report he gave me showed less than $100,000 in overdue debt. His face hardened for half a second. Brooke turned toward him. 300, she said. Ryan had apparently told her I was investing much less. He recovered by saying the higher amount would provide a safety reserve. I nodded as though satisfied and requested that every obligation be explained at the final meeting. Brooke stayed behind after Ryan left. She stood in the kitchen staring at the unsigned agreement. How much do you know? She asked. I told her enough to understand that Ryan had concealed the Grant Bell loan, the shell companies, and the guarantee bearing my copied signature. Her shoulders dropped. She admitted Ryan had recently asked her to sign another lien document against their home, claiming it would consolidate business debt. She had refused because the notary page was incomplete. He keeps saying one closing will solve everything. She whispered. I asked whether she had seen the file Sophie mentioned. Brooke looked frightened that I knew about it. She said the safe contained lender letters, tax notices, and copies of my financial statements. But Ryan had changed the combination after their argument. For a moment, I thought she was ready to help. Then she said, You could still save us, Walt, even if he lied. Sophie shouldn't lose her home. I told her Sophie's safety mattered, but paying a hidden debt would not make the lying stop. Brooke's eyes filled with tears. That's easy to say when you own 2 houses. Then she walked out. Her words stayed with me because they revealed the family equation Ryan had built. Anyone with more was responsible for erasing the consequences of anyone with less, regardless of how the problem began. My restraint was labeled cruelty. His deception was relabeled desperation. That evening, Sophie called from a friend's house and asked whether her parents were getting divorced. I told her I did not know and that none of it was her fault. She said Ryan had been shouting that Brooke was choosing Dad over the family. Then she sent me an audio file recorded unintentionally while her phone was charging on the kitchen counter. In it, Brooke asked whether I had actually signed the business guarantee. Ryan replied, Not that exact page, but he signed the source document. He would have said yes eventually. Brooke said that was not permission. Ryan answered, It was the only way to keep the company alive. The recording lasted less than a minute, but it joined motive to method. I told Sophie to delete any copies from her phone after forwarding the original to Helen. Do not record anything else. I said, You are a child in this family, not evidence in a case. The next morning, Helen preserved the recording with its metadata and sent a formal demand that Ryan withdraw the guardianship petition. She did not reveal every piece of evidence, only that we possessed material contradicting his sworn statements. Ryan's response came through his attorney. He would withdraw only after I executed the power of attorney and signed a binding sale agreement. It was no longer even disguised as concern. Helen requested an expedited hearing and warned his attorney that conditioning withdrawal on control of my property could be presented to the judge. By afternoon, Ryan called me directly. Why are you turning this into a criminal case? He demanded. I told him I had made no criminal report. Helen is threatening my lawyer. He said, Brooke is panicking. Sophie won't speak to me. You're tearing apart the family to prove a point. I reminded him that he filed the petition. He shouted that he did it because I left him no choice. Then he caught himself and lowered his voice. Dad, sign the sale papers. I'll fix the company. Repay everything. And we can forget this happened. I answered. That is not the same as making it right. Our plan depended on obtaining a complete acknowledgement from Ryan in front of witnesses. Helen proposed a closing-style meeting at her office. I would tell Ryan I was prepared to sell the Lakewood house and fund Mercer Ridge, but only after all creditors confirmed the amounts owed and the money flow was documented. Ryan would have to invite Grant Bell, his business accountant, Brooke, and the bank representative handling the disputed credit line. I worried he would refuse, but Daniel believed the deadline on the private note would force him to cooperate. I called Ryan and sounded defeated. I don't want to spend another month fighting in court. I said, Bring everyone together. Show me exactly where the money goes, and I'll sign if Helen says the paperwork is clean. He asked whether I would include the Colorado Springs house in the transaction. I said, We can discuss all available assets. That was not a promise. But he heard one. His voice warmed immediately. Thank you, Dad. Mom would want us to stop hurting each other. I gripped the phone until my knuckles ached. He was still using her memory as leverage. Ryan's counterattack came sooner than expected. Daniel went to Mercer Ridge with a document preservation notice and found the office locks changed. The receptionist had been dismissed. Several filing cabinets were gone, and the company server had been replaced after what Ryan called a cybersecurity incident. When Helen's process server delivered a demand for electronic records, Ryan claimed an employee had lost the phone containing old text messages and that water damage had destroyed archived paper files in a storage unit. The timing was obvious, but proving intentional destruction would take time. Worse, Grant Bell's attorney sent notice that foreclosure proceedings against pledged business assets would begin within 10 days. Ryan was running out of time, which made him both easier to pressure and more dangerous. Daniel admitted some direct evidence might be gone. I felt the plan slipping. Elaine's archive proved what Ryan had done to me, but we still needed current records to establish where the proposed investment would actually go. Helen reminded me that a trap does not require every hidden document. It requires him to state his position clearly while the people affected are listening. She said, "Let him explain the missing pieces himself." Brooke finally broke with Ryan after discovering that their home equity had already been pledged through a financing statement she did not understand signing. She came to see me carrying an overnight bag and a folder of photocopies she had removed from the house before Ryan changed the locks. The documents showed missed payments, personal charges routed through Bridge Consulting, and correspondence from Grant Bell demanding repayment from the Lakewood sale. Brooke did not apologize immediately. She sat at Elaine's kitchen table and said, "I kept telling myself he was protecting the company because people depended on him. Then I realized he said the same thing every time I found another lie." She planned to stay with her sister and consult a divorce attorney, though she had not decided whether the separation would be permanent. I asked whether she would attend the final meeting. She hesitated. "If I go, Ryan will say I betrayed him." I looked at the papers she had brought. He has been asking all of us to prove loyalty by accepting whatever he hides. Brooke wiped her eyes and agreed to attend, but only to protect herself and Sophie. That was enough. The guardianship hearing occurred 3 days before the planned meeting. Ryan sat across the courtroom beside his attorney, looking tired but composed. Dr. Feld testified that I was fully competent, understood the disputed transactions, and demonstrated better financial reasoning than many younger adults she evaluated. Helen introduced the bank fraud alert and the conditional demand linking withdrawal of the petition to my signature. Ryan's attorney tried to argue that his urgency came from concern, but the judge was visibly skeptical. She denied temporary control, ordered Ryan to preserve records, and warned that misuse of guardianship proceedings for financial leverage could result in sanctions. The petition remained technically pending until Ryan filed a withdrawal. But my investment restrictions were lifted that afternoon. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I watched Ryan leave the courthouse without looking at me and felt the loss beneath the legal win. He was my only son. I had taught him to ride a bicycle in the driveway and held his hand when he needed stitches. Now we communicated through sworn declarations and preservation orders. That night, I drove to Colorado Springs alone and played the video Elaine had recorded near the end of her life. She sat in the upstairs office wearing a blue scarf over her thinning hair. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were clear. "Walt," she said, "if you are watching this, then Ryan has probably made you believe protecting yourself is the same as abandoning him." She explained no new facts. Instead, she named the pattern I had refused to see. Every rescue had preserved Ryan's pride while reducing his need to change. She asked me not to sell the blue house to cover his debts. "I did not leave it to you so you could turn it into another apology," she said. "I left it so you would have somewhere that was yours after everyone started telling you what you owed them." I paused the video and cried harder than I had at the funeral, because grief finally had something specific to strike. Elaine had not trusted me to be strong, but she had still built a path for me to become stronger after she was gone. The final meeting was scheduled for Friday at 10 in Helen's conference room. Ryan agreed to bring his accountant, business attorney, and Grant Bell. Brooke would attend with separate counsel. The bank sent a fraud investigator and a lending officer. Daniel prepared a timeline linking the copied signatures, shell company transfers, and proposed sale proceeds. Helen arranged the evidence in labeled folders. each containing documents already discovered in Elaine's office or obtained during the previous weeks. Nothing depended on a surprise witness or a newly invented record. The strength came from sequence. Before leaving the Colorado Springs house, I removed the brass key from my ring and held it in my palm. It represented the one asset Ryan believed could still rescue him. I placed it in my pocket beside Elaine's letter. On Friday morning, I arrived early and sat at the end of the conference table. Ryan entered carrying a thick binder and a prepared investment contract. He looked around at the creditors, lawyers, and accountants, then said, "Let's finish this before Dad changes his mind again." I placed the brass key in the center of the table and watched every face turn toward it. Ryan's eyes stayed on the brass key I had placed in the center of Helen's conference table. Grant Bell sat 2 chairs away, broad-shouldered and expressionless. With his attorney beside him, the bank's fraud investigator had a red folder open in front of her. Brooke sat across from Ryan with her own lawyer, her wedding ring still on but turned inward against her palm. Daniel occupied the chair nearest the projector. Helen stood at the far end of the room and asked whether everyone understood the purpose of the meeting. Ryan answered before anyone else. "We're here to finalize the Lakewood sale and fund Mercer Ridge." He slid a thick agreement toward me. "Dad gets a preferred return. Grant gets paid. And the company keeps operating." He spoke as though the decision had already been made. I picked up the contract but did not open it. "Before I sign anything," I said, "I want every person here to hear exactly what I authorized, what I did not authorize, and where this money was supposed to go." Ryan leaned back and looked at his attorney, who nodded for him to continue. He presented a polished summary of Mercer Ridge's projects, employee count, and projected revenue. He called the private loan a temporary bridge caused by delayed customer payments. He described the home equity application against my Lakewood property as preliminary family planning and the business guarantee as documentation of an understanding we had reached verbally. When Grant Bell asked whether the Lakewood house was already listed, Ryan said closing could occur within 30 days. Brooke stared at him. I watched her realize he was still speaking as if she would handle the sale. Ryan then pointed to the key. "And if Dad wants to preserve the old house, there are other assets available." He did not say Colorado Springs, but every person at the table understood he knew. I asked him one question. "Did I give you written permission to borrow against either house?" Ryan's face tightened. "You gave me permission to protect the family," I said. "That was not my question." The room went quiet. I repeated it. "Did I sign the home equity application?" Ryan looked at the bank investigator instead of me. The signature was applied through documents Dad had already approved. I asked whether I had signed the $150,000 business guarantee. He said I had signed the source paperwork and understood the company needed support. "Did I see the guarantee?" I asked. Ryan's attorney interrupted, saying the meeting should focus on settlement rather than accusation. Helen calmly replied that no valid settlement could be reached without identifying disputed obligations. I opened the fax folder and removed the hospital insurance acknowledgement I had signed while Elaine received chemotherapy. Then I placed the guarantee beside it. "The signature on this page came from that page," I said. "I never saw the guarantee. I never approved it. I never agreed to be responsible for Mercer Ridge's debt." Ryan looked at me with open anger. "You would have signed if I had explained the situation," I answered. "Believing I might agree is not the same as obtaining my consent." Helen turned on the projector. Daniel displayed a timeline beginning 11 months before Elaine's death. The hospital acknowledgement appeared first, followed by the business guarantee containing the copied signature. Next came the supplier references, the bridge consulting transfers, the private note to Grant Bell, and the home equity application filed after the funeral. Each entry was supported by a document Elaine had stored, a lender record, or electronic metadata Daniel had already verified. There was no dramatic surprise. The power came from seeing the steps arranged in order. Ryan had obtained a genuine signature, reused it on a guarantee, accessed my financial information, concealed business debts, investigated the Colorado Springs property, and submitted a loan request against my home. Daniel enlarged the signature images until the identical pen breaks were visible. The bank investigator asked Ryan whether he disputed that the electronic signature had been copied from the power of attorney draft. Ryan said his staff handled document uploads. Daniel replied that the application originated from an internet address assigned to Ryan's office. Ryan's attorney whispered to him, but Ryan pushed the attorney's hand away. The fraud investigator spoke next. She confirmed the bank had frozen the $250,000 credit request because I denied authorizing it. She explained that the application contained accurate private information that could only have come from tax returns, investment statements, or direct account access. She also confirmed Ryan was listed as the secondary contact and intended recipient of all approval communications. The proposed disbursement instructions directed the funds to Bridge Consulting. She said. Brooke turned sharply toward Ryan. Grant Bell's attorney asked who owned Bridge Consulting. Daniel answered that Ryan controlled it through a registered agent. The account had previously received funds from Mercer Ridge and paid personal expenses, including vehicles and credit cards. Ryan protested that Bridge was a legitimate management entity. Daniel asked for contracts, invoices, or payroll records proving services. Ryan said those files had been lost during the server replacement. Helen reminded him that records disappeared after the preservation demand. His attorney finally told him to stop speaking. I watched my son's confidence change into calculation. For the first time, he understood that charm would not rearrange the facts. Grant Bell closed the loan file in front of him. You told me repayment was secured by family property you had authority to access, he said. Ryan insisted he expected me to cooperate. Bell asked whether I had ever signed his loan documents. Ryan admitted I had not. Bell's expression remained controlled. But the message was clear. He had made an expensive loan based partly on representations Ryan could not support. Brooke's attorney then produced the financing statement attached to Ryan and Brooke's residence. Brooke said she had been told it was routine refinancing paperwork, not a pledge connected to Mercer Ridge. Ryan turned toward her. You knew the company needed liquidity. She answered. I knew what you chose to tell me. He accused her of abandoning him when the business was under pressure. Brooke's voice shook, but she did not retreat. You used the same excuse with your father, your mother, and me. Every time we discovered a lie, you called the truth disloyal. Ryan looked around the table as if searching for one person still willing to accept his version. Nobody spoke. I picked up the brass key. This opens the house in Colorado Springs, I said. Ryan stared at it with a hunger he could no longer hide. I explained that Elaine inherited the property in 2018, maintained it as separate property, and recorded a beneficiary deed naming me. The transfer had become effective upon her death and had been confirmed through the county records. The house carried no mortgage, no lien, and no agreement involving Ryan. Its estimated value is $465,000. I said. Grant Bell leaned back. Ryan leaned forward. Then this is simple, he said. Sell that house instead of Lakewood. You can keep your home. Grant gets paid, and nobody loses everything. I placed the key back on the table. I am not selling it to pay your debt. His expression hardened. I told him Elaine had used the house to preserve the records he tried to hide. She had left it to me because she feared I would keep rescuing him. She knew you were in trouble, Ryan said, and she chose a building over her own son. I answered. She chose not to reward what you were doing. Ryan stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward. He accused Elaine of manipulating him, Helen of exploiting a grieving widower, Daniel of twisting ordinary business practices into crimes, and Brooke of trying to protect herself at his expense. Then he turned on me. You told me everything you worked for would be mine someday. I remembered saying versions of that over the years. Usually after a few drinks at Christmas or while showing him the workshop, I had meant that love outlasted ownership. Ryan had heard a promise of access. Someday is not today, I said. An inheritance is not permission to take from a living person. He said I had created his expectations by paying every bill and solving every crisis. That accusation contained a truth I could not escape. You're right, I told him. I helped build this problem. I taught you that I would always step in before consequences reached you, but I did not teach you to copy my signature. I did not teach you to lie to your wife. I did not teach you to ask a court to take away my rights. Helen placed two documents in front of Ryan. The first was a written withdrawal of the guardianship and conservatorship petition. The second was an acknowledgement stating that I had not authorized the guarantee, the home equity application, or the use of my financial information. It also required Ryan to produce all remaining company records, notify affected lenders of the disputed documents, and refrain from representing that he controlled either of my properties. His attorney read both carefully. Ryan asked what would happen if he refused. The bank investigator said the institution would refer the application for further fraud review regardless, but cooperation would be documented. Grant Bell's attorney said his client would pursue collection through lawful claims against Ryan and Mercer Ridge, not against property Ryan did not own. Helen said I had sufficient grounds for civil action and could make a criminal complaint concerning the copied signatures. I have not agreed to waive any rights. She added. Ryan looked at me. Are you threatening to send your own son to prison? I answered. I am giving you one chance to stop making me responsible for the consequences of your choices. For nearly a minute, Ryan said nothing. The room's ventilation system hummed above us. He looked at Brooke, but she lowered her eyes. He looked at Grant Bell, who offered no rescue. Finally, Ryan asked whether signing would save Mercer Ridge. Daniel told him the company's survival would depend on honest restructuring, asset sales, creditor negotiations, and possibly bankruptcy protection. There would be no $300,000 investment from me. There would be no proceeds from either house. Ryan's shoulders seemed to collapse under the weight of a future that required truth instead of money. He signed the withdrawal first. Then he signed the acknowledgement, pressing the pen so hard the final letter tore the paper. His attorney countersigned as a witness. Helen collected the documents immediately. I expected satisfaction, but what I felt was grief. The boy from the photograph above my fireplace was still somewhere inside the man across from me. I simply could not keep financing the distance between them. The guardianship petition was formally dismissed 4 days later. Dr. Feld's report and the withdrawal allowed my investment firm to remove every restriction from my accounts. The bank denied the home equity application permanently and completed its fraud review. I did not file an immediate criminal complaint, but I preserved that option in writing and required Ryan's continued cooperation with the lenders. Grant Bell sued Mercer Ridge for default and negotiated possession of several pieces of equipment rather than pursuing claims based on non-existent family collateral. The company entered a court-supervised restructuring, sold 2 trucks, closed its decorative showroom, and laid off employees it could no longer afford. Some workers found new positions through competing contractors. Others blamed Ryan publicly. The local business magazine removed his profile from its promotional page. The thing he valued most, his image as a self-made success, did not survive. Yet he was not destroyed. A smaller version of the company continued under an outside financial manager, and Ryan was required to submit monthly reports instead of controlling every account himself. Brooke and Ryan separated. She moved with Sophie into a rented townhouse near her sister, and their attorneys began dividing personal and business obligations. Brooke apologized to me for supporting the guardianship petition, but I did not pretend the apology erased what she had done. I told her trust could return only through consistent behavior. She accepted that without argument. Sophie continued visiting me on weekends, though I made one rule clear. She was never to carry messages between adults or report on her father. She deserved a family role that did not involve choosing sides. Ryan did not speak to me for almost 3 months. Through his attorney, he produced the remaining records and corrected the false lender statements. I heard he attended financial counseling required by the restructuring agreement. I also heard he blamed me during the first sessions. That did not surprise me. Responsibility often enters a room after anger has exhausted itself. I stopped asking for updates. For the first time, I allowed my son's recovery to belong to him. In January, I listed the Lakewood house with an independent agent who had no connection to Brooke or Mercer Ridge. I sold it for $718,000 after an ordinary inspection and a transparent closing. I did not sell because Ryan told me I was too old for stairs. I sold because every room had become a conversation with Elaine, and I needed to remember her without living inside the hospital bed. Medicine bottles, and final silence. I moved permanently to the Blue House in Colorado Springs. I kept Elaine's upstairs office, but I removed Ryan's binders from the open shelves and placed them in secure storage with Helen. I did not want betrayal to become the centerpiece of my new life. Using part of the Lakewood proceeds, I created the Elaine Mercer Skilled Trades Fund through a local community college. Each year, it would pay tuition and tools for adults training as electricians, HVAC technicians, and other trades. Elaine had believed records could protect people. I decided her name should also help people build something. Helen helped me establish a trust with clear terms. My retirement income and properties remained under my control during my lifetime. Sophie would receive educational support directly through the trust, not through either parent. Ryan was not disinherited, but any future distribution required proof that he had resolved the fraudulent obligations, maintained stable finances, and avoided using family members as lenders. Those conditions were not punishment. They were boundaries written in language nobody could reinterpret at a kitchen table. 6 months after the conference room meeting, Ryan came to the Colorado Springs house alone. He parked on the street and walked to the porch without a binder, contract, or locksmith. I watched him through the same doorbell camera that had recorded him saying I did not know the house existed. When I opened the door, he looked older. "I'm not here for money," he said. I answered, "That is the first thing you've said in a long time that I needed to hear." Ryan apologized, though not perfectly. He admitted copying the signatures and hiding the Bell loan. He admitted filing the guardianship petition to pressure me. He still talked about fear, employees, and the possibility of losing everything, as though desperation reduced the seriousness of what he had done. I did not argue with every excuse. I told him an apology was not a negotiation, and that I would judge change by what he did after leaving my porch. He asked whether I would ever trust him again. "Not the way I used to," I said. The answer hurt him, but it was honest. Then I moved aside and invited him to sit outside with me. We drank coffee, his, not mine, and watched late sunlight touch the roofs across the street. We did not repair 41 years in one conversation. We simply spoke without documents between us. Elaine had left me a second house, but the house was never the real inheritance. The real gift was the locked door she taught me. I was allowed to keep locked until love arrived without demanding a key.